UDP, what do we really mean by that when we talk about it as IT professionals? Find out more next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Ports and protocols, there are plenty of them for us to dive into, and Wes Bryan is going to help us to understand this. All right, Wes, there's plenty of these things here. What are we actually going to be taking a look at today?
So we're going to help our viewers out there to identify some of the most common ports and protocols that we use inside of network communications today, because if you're in a certification endeavor, they might test you on this. And if you're in a support endeavor, you're going to be configuring these in the field, then it is going to be important to know what these protocols are and know the ports that are associated with them when you're configuring them.
All right, sounds like it's time to head over to the bench.
All right, everyone, go ahead and follow me. I've got my computer set up here, and we've got a series of protocols that we need to talk about. Now, before we actually get into looking at the various ports and protocols, we kind of define, well, what is a protocol and what is a port? All right, well, a protocol is a set of rules for a specific type of communication between two endpoints, right? So when I need to, let's say, make a communication with a type of server out there, and I need a resource, we're going to use a certain protocol, a structured set of rules for that type of communication in order to provide and get access to that service. Now, it is also important to understand that when we talk about ports, ports are an identifier. They're a logical endpoint of a connection, if you will. And when I'm going to send a request out over a network for a certain service that the protocol provides, I'm going to send it to a device that's listening, typically a server, and that server's listening out and it's saying, all right, I see that incoming port. I can identify with the service that's being requested here, and I am that server, and I can respond back to you. Now, when it comes to ports, we have to understand that there are a certain set of ports that you have to be able to identify. And the first ones that we call are what are known as just port ranges, right? The first one being something known as the well-known ports. So what are the well-known ports? Well, understand the well-known ports, these are the common services. These are the common protocols that we use within our networks today. And that's why they're called well-known. They're easily identified, and most computing systems will recognize these protocols. Now, that range, if you will, is from 0 to 1023. Be able to identify that if you're on a certification exam, but it's also important to understand that if you are supporting these protocols, you need to know that the well-known protocols fall within those ranges.
Yeah, it's kind of neat here that the very fact is, as data is going across, most applications that we see, they tend to assign themselves their own port numbers, and then they get registered or recognized across the internet as using that, and it just becomes familiar so that you don't have to guess what it's going to be when you actually know something is coming in on that particular port number as well.
Definitely, and the communications for networking that were standard, these protocols that were standardized, a lot of those early protocols and the major ones that we use fall within that range, but that's not the only range that we have, right? In totality, we have 65,535 protocols, 0 being included, so technically 65,536. The next port range is going to be what's known as the registered port range. Now, the registered port range a lot of times is where organizations have a specific piece of software and they set aside and register a port, if you will, within this range. So for instance, Microsoft has something known that we'll look at a little bit called RDP, right? That's port 3389. It fits right in there in the registered port range. I want you to be able to know the register port range, all right? Because the register port range starts at that 1024 and goes all the way up to 49151. That is your register port range. Now, the last range that we have, the upper end of that range, is actually what's known as dynamic ports, right? The dynamic ports are the ones that your computers, when they request a service via that protocol and they send it out with a port number to the server that's listening out, well, the server has to respond back. So your computers will dynamically generate these temporary ports that are in that 49,152 all the way up to 65,535. And these will be used for communications, but then once that communication's done, your computer will generate other dynamic ports for outbound communications as well. So that is the dynamic port range. All right, the dynamic port range, again, 49,152, all the way up to 65,535. These are your port ranges, and a little history behind that real quick. Remember that the Internet Assigned Numbering Authority, INA, if I can get the acronym right, they're the ones that actually set this up in the earlier days of networking, and it is the body, if you will, that largely has dictated what these port ranges are.
Now, we had mentioned during our opening that we'd be talking about the idea of TCP and UDP. There's a lot of confusion on this as you read across the internet because they also associate things like what they say connectionless protocols and connection-oriented protocols. Help us out with that.
Oh, absolutely, Ronnie. So when we talk about certain protocols, right, some protocols can be connection-oriented, and what that means really is that they provide reliable delivery, right, and error checking. And if the information isn't received in the right order, then that information is going to be dropped, and the connection-oriented protocol will call back to the source and say, hey, I need you to resend this information. We didn't get it right. That is what is known as transmission control protocol-based ports. That's kind of having like delivery confirmation on your mail, right? You send your mail over, snail mail, if you will, across the postal carrier service, if you will. And what happens is, well, the envelope is going to be marked, and then you are going to get a confirmation that, yes, it was received at the other end. That's transmission control protocol. Now, there are times when maybe speed is of the essence, and you don't need the complexities of checking every single piece of information that's going to the endpoint and saying, hey, I received it, or hey, I didn't receive it, but you need fast delivery. Well, that's where we talk about connectionless services, and that's User Datagram Protocol, UDP. It is what we call best effort delivery. That's like putting your mail in the mailbox and walking away from it, and you just hope it gets there, right? We're not actually checking on that. Now, again, there are purposes for these different types of communications. Transmission Control Protocol provides you that reliable delivery when you cannot afford to have data corruption. UDP says, let's give you the fastest service, and if you need any kind of connection-oriented service, well, the application itself is going to have to actually provide that. So those are the differences, right? One, reliable delivery. One is a best effort delivery.
Now, when it comes to that, the neat thing about it is most of the things that we tend to see that go across the internet are really not based on UDP, but really based on TCP. That idea, that connection-oriented protocol to ensure across the entire networks, right, that the stuff gets there exactly the way that it's supposed to. So Wes, with understanding that, what are some of the different protocols that we need to learn about?
Yeah, Ronnie, probably the life's blood of a lot of organizations are protocols surrounding email, right? It's our communication system. It's how we communicate with the outside world, if you will. And one of the things that I would be aware of these email protocols are the types that you have and the port values, port numbers that are associated with them. Though there's three that we have to worry about. So for instance, if I'm in my email server here, or I'm in my Gmail, I should say, that we have created for these for these demonstrations. And if I choose settings, you can actually see some indication of these various protocols here. So let me see all settings here inside of Gmail. And I want you to notice that we have this forwarding and this POP and IMAP, right? These are the settings for some of the email protocols that you might see. All right, if we're talking about something like the Post Office Protocol version 3, that is for receiving email over what is known as port number 110. Now, interestingly enough, when we talk about the Post Office Protocol version 3, POP3, when we download email via that protocol, that email is going to be wiped from the server. All right, so it is important to understand that. Now, the other email protocol that we have, and it's been around for a long time, is what's known as the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. This is SMTP. Now, SMTP allows you the ability to send outbound email over port 25. The more common one that we see today is the one that is in this list right here if I want to enable something like IMAP. IMAP is the Internet Message Access Protocol. And what's great about this is this gives me the ability to look and view my emails just like they were local, but I can work with them up on the web server, right? So this is another common email protocol, and that is port 143. Be able to recognize the purpose of these protocols as well as the port values associated with them.
All right, there's no doubt that email actually is going to be one of the most important things that we do have to know about, But we also need to actually think about, well, web protocols. Help us out with that.
Sure, web protocol is another very common protocol that is out there, providing us the ability to connect to web servers and render HTML pages locally. There is a protocol that's been around for a long time that has allowed us to do that, and that's HTTP. That's the Hypertext Transport Protocol. And that goes over port 80. However, it has been discouraged from being used because of the security vulnerabilities around it and people being able to gain unauthorized access to the communications between your browser and the web server, which is why we use protocols like, for instance, this right here. So I'm on ACI Learning's webpage, and one of the things you're going to notice is that I have this little lock right here. Well, what does the lock represent? That lets me know that currently we are using HTTPS. If you can see it right there in the URL, that is the Hypertext Transport Layer. And in earlier days, it would be over Secure Socket Layer. Today, it's just, think of it as HTTP Secure. And what it does is it provides something known as a TLS encryption mechanism that, for you, I want you to remember, keeps unauthorized, or the goal is to keep unauthorized access out of your communications between the web server and your browser. These are two important protocols, port 80 for HTTP, port 443 for HTTPS.
Yeah, actually, you make a good point here, especially about the idea of security, and something that you should know as an A+ technician moving forward, that when somebody does connect to a website across the internet, they probably should never actually connect to one that only is serving up HTTP because you can never really verify the identity of that particular server that you're connecting to. With HTTPS, though, you can actually get that verification that you are connecting to the right server. All right, now Wes, now that we actually understand more about the idea of email and, of course, the web protocols that we have to be familiar with, what about file protocols? What are we mentioning there?
Sure, file protocols are another one that are really big, and there are one really that we use a lot that's been around for a very long time. What I'm talking about is something known as FTP. That's the File Transfer Protocol. This goes back to the earliest days of the internet, so it's been around for a very long time. And FTP actually uses two ports. It uses port 20, if you will, for what are known as control and command ports. Let me show you what I mean. So I can drop down to a command prompt, and if I want, I could issue some commands out to the FTP server, maybe put a file up there, pull a file down, if you will. Well, that right there, those commands go over port 20. However, when I connect and I access the resources, the data is coming over port 21. Now, one of the great things about FTP is that being an application type protocol is that it works with web browsers. I could drop to the command prompt if I want, and I can issue commands against an FTP server, and that's going all the way back to the earlier days when there weren't any graphical user interfaces. But FTP also allows you the ability to connect via a graphical user interface. So for instance, University of South Florida has their FTP server out there, and if I click it, one of the things that you're going to see here is that I have access to their file structure, and this is in our File Explorer. So even though I'm connecting to an FTP server over the public internet, you'll notice that I actually have ftp.usf.edu. We're using the File Transfer Protocol. I also want you to know that the File Transfer Protocol, FTP, uses that connection-oriented protocol that Ronnie was mentioning in TCP. Now, it has the complexities, it's highly optimized for large file transfer, but it uses transmission control protocol. And sometimes you need to deliver small files and you need speed versus all of the complexities of that connection-oriented service. And that's where another protocol comes in, and that's known as Trivial File Transfer Protocol. It is a stripped down, you consider it as FTP light, right? It strips all the complexities of TCP and it uses essentially UDP. That is another port, Trivial File Transfer Protocol, that doesn't have all of the command structure that FTP does, but it does allow you to download small files, really optimized, and it uses the user datagram protocol. Now that is going to be over port 69, if you will. So FTP ports 20 and 21, Trivial File Transfer Protocol, TFTP, this is going to be port 69.
All right, there's also, of course, our ability to be able to use these ports to connect to remote machines, right?
There are. And in the earlier days, we would drop down to, and again, like FTP, going all the way back to some of the earlier days of the internet, what we would use to connect to things like mainframes from a terminal is a terminal emulation software, something like Telnet, which is just telenetworking, if you will. Now, This protocol is, again, it allows you to make connections and test if ports are open, which is really nice. It does use port 23, but it's one of those protocols that, again, if you have, it has security issues because when you're issuing these commands, there's no security around them. And again, if somebody could potentially gain unauthorized access. That's why we use other types of ports today. And by the way, let me go ahead and mention port 23 for Telnet, but we also use things like SSH. SSH is the secure shell, and what that does is it creates an encrypted communication, a secure communication between source and destination, and then the commands that flow through that encrypted communication allow for the protection from unauthorized access. SSH, or secure shell, uses port 22. Now, that's not the only remote connection-based protocols. It's probably one of the most common in your Linux environments, and in some of your Linux servers, you're going to be using something like SSH. However, if you're in a Windows world, you can be using something like potentially remote desktop protocol. So for instance, I'm on my server here. Maybe I decide that I want to make a connection over a remote desktop connection using something known as the remote desktop protocol. Well, I can fire up a piece of software like Microsoft's remote desktop connection, and what I could do is I could put the computer name in here and I could choose connect. And notice that what I'm doing here essentially is connecting to this machine over the network via the remote desktop protocol, and that's port 3389. And this allows me to remotely control the desktop of another machine. So I'm on server 02, and what I did is I'm connecting over the network back into another computer, making a remote connection via remote desktop protocol via port 3389. And now you can see that if I look, I'm now on my domain controller, right? I'm no longer on that server 02, and I can manage and control the desktop. So remember those ports as well. Telnet, security issues, port 23, Secure Shell is what you should be using. SSH to connect to these machines remotely if you're not in a Windows environment. If you're in a Windows environment, you're going to use RDP. SSH port 22, RDP port 3389.
Now, there's also, of course, a bunch of different protocols that we're going to have to just be familiar with and learn. But learning them now will actually help as we actually go ahead and advance our career through our IT career, which are going to be networking services, right?
Definitely, Ronnie. And I'm going to go ahead and what I'd like to talk about, since we're already mentioning, I connected to the domain controller. So let's take some of the technical jargon off of that, right? A domain controller is a directory services server within an Active Directory domain. It's not the only directory services out there, but it's one of the most popular really in the world, in the enterprise level market. And it's using something known as LDAP, right? LDAP is the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now, it uses other protocols, but it also uses LDAP. The Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, when I need to connect to a directory services database and communicate with it, send queries against it to retrieve information, it's going to be over that port 389. If you're in a certification endeavor, exam alert on this one. Do not confuse LDAP and RDP, because LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, is port 389. RDP is port 3389. And we can see that if I'm running something like Active Directory Directory Services, that's essentially going to be my LDAP server. Now, there are other things that we have to take into consideration too. One of the networking services that we use so much today is what's known as DNS. All right, well, the DNS service, when you are communicating via the DNS protocol, you are going to communicate over port 53. So when I need to do name resolution and map that fully qualified domain name to its IP address, and I make a request to that DNS server to find that IP address, it's listening out on port 53 for those incoming requests. So DNS port 53. Now, that's not the only thing we have, too. Let me go ahead, and what I'd like to do is hop back on over to my DHCP server, and we'll look at DHCP. Now, DHCP is another service, a protocol, it's a service, it's a protocol that's associated with a service, if you will. And the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, allowing us to dynamically assign IP addresses, that goes over port 68 and port 67. There are other network services that are out there. I mentioned DNS. In a Windows domain or in a Windows world, you also have an older naming convention or an old name resolution service, and that's called NetBIOS. And NetBIOS goes over port 137 and 139. This is an earlier, non-scalable, non-routable, legacy-type naming resolution service in a Windows environment. So know that NetBIOS, about NetBIOS, port 137 and port 139. Now, moving down the line, we also have some protocols that allow us to share resources within a Windows environment. So if I go ahead and I open up our File Explorer here on Server 01, I can actually connect back to administrative shares, if you will, that are on my domain controller. Notice that we made a connection here, Ronnie. All right, I'm using a UNC path, the Universal Naming Convention. Oops, try that again. There we go. And what I did is I connected over the network, and as I connect over the network, it's using something known as Server Message Block inside of a Windows environment, not only to share files, but to share any resources, a folder, if you will, share printers out there. We use the Server Message Block. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to be port 445. And last but not least, a very important network service that as you move into your careers, you're going to probably work with a lot more is something known as the Simple Network Management Protocol, SNMP. SNMP is a protocol that allows you to track the health of your connectivity devices, variety of networking devices on your network, that they can send information back over the network to a management station. And you can figure out how they doing. Are they healthy? How long have they been online? Are they having any issues? There are two ports for that one that I want you to be aware of. That's port 161 and port 162. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're in certification endeavors, I would know these ports and be able to identify the port and protocol associations. And if you are in a support role, you should be able to do that as well, because a time might come where you have to sit down and you have to configure one of these protocols. To do it correctly, you have to know the associated port values.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.